The boy had blood on his shirt and lies in his eyes. Josie noticed the blood first, a dark stain spreading below his ribs, half hidden beneath a coat 2 sizes too large, and she noticed the lies second, in the way he sat with his back pressed hard against the diner wall, watching the door like something outside might come through it. He was maybe 8 years old, maybe 9. Small enough that his boots didn't reach the floor, dangling above the cracked linoleum while he stared at the laminated menu, as though reading it very carefully, as though being very busy with the menu made him invisible. It was well past midnight. Josie had been about to lock up. She stood behind the counter with her ring of keys still in her hand, the overhead lights humming their tired song above the empty booths. The smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease thick in the air the way it always was after a long shift. The diner had been quiet for 2 hours. The last customer, old Mercer, who came in every night for pie and conversation, had left at 10. She had already wiped the counter, already turned the sign, already told herself she deserved a warm bath and 6 hours of dreamless sleep. Then the bell above the door had chimed, and the boy had come in. She hadn't asked questions right away. That wasn't how Josie was built. She had grown up in a house where asking too many questions too fast meant you didn't get the truth. You just got better lies. And so she had learned to watch first, to let things settle, to give people the room to show her who they were before she decided what to do about it. She was 26 now, and she still worked that way. And it had served her well enough behind the counter of a roadside diner at the edge of territory most people didn't discuss too loudly. She set the keys down. She poured a glass of milk without being asked. She set it in front of him along with a plate of whatever was left in the warmer. Scrambled eggs, 2 strips of bacon, a biscuit that had gone slightly hard on one side. And she didn't say a word. The boy looked at the food. Then he looked at her. His eyes were remarkable. Too old for his face, too sharp for a child who was pretending not to be afraid. Gray-green, like rain on pine needles, like something seen through glass. He had dark hair, disheveled and damp at the temples, and a cut along his jaw that hadn't quite stopped bleeding. "You can eat," she said simply. "I'm not going to ask you anything yet." He ate, quickly, the way someone eats when they aren't sure the plate won't be taken away. Josie busied herself behind the counter, stacking cups she'd already stacked, pretending to check inventory she'd already checked. She let him eat every scrap. Then she poured him a second glass of milk and slid a piece of cherry pie across the counter without comment. He looked at the pie for a long moment. "I don't have money," he said. His voice was low, carefully controlled for someone his age. "I didn't ask for money," she replied. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite trust, but the possibility of it. He picked up the fork. Outside, the wind was doing something unusual. Josie had lived near the Ashevale Wood her entire life, and she knew its sounds the way she knew the sounds of the diner, intimately, without thinking. And tonight it was not behaving correctly. There were no animals moving through the brush, no owls, no rustle of smaller things in the undergrowth. The forest beyond the road was silent in the specific way that meant something very large was moving through it, and everything else had gone still in deference. She told herself it was nothing. She was good at telling herself things were nothing. The boy finished the pie. He set the fork down with unexpected precision and looked at her directly for the first time. "Thank you," he said. "My name is Eli." "Josie?" she said. "I know." He said it without thinking, and then his jaw tightened, as if he'd made a mistake. He looked away. She let that go for now. "You're hurt," she said instead, nodding toward his ribs. "It's not bad. It's still bleeding. It'll stop." He said it the way someone says it when they know from experience it will stop. Not with hope, but with certainty. Josie had grown up on the edge of shifter territory. She understood what that particular certainty meant. She understood what the boy was, even if he hadn't said it. even if she was pretending not to understand in order to keep him comfortable. She went to the back, retrieved the first aid kit she kept under the register, and set it on the counter without making it into something. "You don't have to let me," she said, "but you can, if you want." He let her. He lifted the oversized coat and then the edge of his shirt, and she cleaned the wound with careful, practiced hands, a gash along his side, already beginning to close faster than it should, which confirmed what she'd suspected. She didn't comment on the speed of healing. She wrapped it cleanly, tied it off, and stepped back. "Thank you," he said again. This time he meant it differently. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" she asked. The silence before his answer was its own kind of answer. Josie looked at the clock above the door. 20 past midnight. She looked at the boy with the old eyes and the healing wound, and the coat that belonged to someone much larger than him. She looked at the door, at the dark road outside, at the tree line beyond it, at the absolute stillness of the forest. "There's a cot in the back room," she said. "It's not comfortable, but it's warm. You can stay until morning, and then we'll figure out the rest." He didn't argue. He didn't thank her again. He just slid off the stool and followed her to the back room. And something about the way he walked, straight-spined, deliberate, already half recovered from whatever had happened to him, made her chest tighten with something she couldn't fully name. She gave him a blanket. She left the lamp on low. She went back to the front of the diner and sat on her stool behind the counter and listened to the forest say nothing. She should have been afraid. She'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone who lived in the townships near Ashvale had heard them. The Alpha King whose territory swallowed 6 packs and kept growing. Cassian of the Ashvale. They didn't even use his full name, as if saying it completely was an invitation. They said he had ended 3 border wars in 2 years. They said he ran his territory like a closed fist. They said that those who crossed him were not punished publicly, because there was no need. They simply were not heard from again. Josie had always sorted those stories into the same drawer where she kept everything she couldn't verify, carefully filed, not forgotten, not believed too hard either way. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat. She breathed. Around 2 a.m, she heard the boy's breathing from the back room slow into sleep, and the tightness in her chest eased slightly. Whatever else was happening, the child was safe right now. That was enough to work with. She was still sitting there, turning her cold teacup in her hands, when the bell above the door chimed again. Josie looked up. The man in the doorway was not something the diner had been built to contain. He stood at the threshold without moving, taking up the frame with the stillness of something that had never needed to announce itself to be noticed. He was tall, considerably so, broad through the shoulder, dressed in dark riding clothes that were damp at the hem from the forest floor, a heavy cloak pushed back. His face was angular and severe, the kind of face that didn't soften easily, that had probably never learned how. Dark hair, rain damp. A jaw that looked like it had been decided on rather than grown. And his eyes, gray-green. Exactly like the boy's. Like rain on pine needles. Like something seen through glass. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Josie set down the teacup. She did not move from behind the counter. Her heart was doing something it wasn't supposed to, but she kept her face calm, the way she'd learned to keep it calm, when she couldn't afford to show what was happening inside her. She had grown up with very little, and had run this diner alone for 3 years, and she had dealt with difficult men before. She had not dealt with one like this. "We're closed," she said. He stepped inside anyway. The door swung shut behind him. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. "I'm looking for someone," he said. His voice was low and even, without inflection, the kind of voice that had given orders for so long it no longer remembered how to ask. A child. He would have come through this road. Josie looked at him. She looked at the eyes that were exactly her sleeping guest's eyes, She looked at the coat the boy was wearing. Enormous, dark, the same cut as the one on the man before her. She looked at the controlled stillness of the man, the careful way he stood, the way his attention had already moved past her to the back of the diner and back again without appearing to move at all. She understood, in that moment, exactly who was standing in her diner. She also understood that the boy was asleep 10 feet away, healing a wound, and that whatever had happened tonight had been frightening enough to make a shifter child sit with his back to a wall and watch the door. "Can I get you something?" she said. "Coffee? We're not officially closed yet." Something crossed his face. Not quite surprise. Recalibration, maybe. "I'm not here for coffee." "I know," she said, "but you look like you've been moving through the forest for a while, and whatever you need to say or do next will probably go better if you sit down first." The silence stretched. The overhead lights hummed. And then, very slowly, the Alpha King of Ashvale pulled out a stool and sat down at her counter. Josie poured the coffee without asking again. It was something she did on instinct, hands moving while her mind worked elsewhere. The familiar ritual of cup and pot and counter giving her something to do that wasn't falling apart. She set the mug in front of him and stepped back to her side of the counter and waited. He didn't touch the coffee immediately. He looked at it the way people look at things when they're thinking about something else entirely. Present in body, somewhere else in attention. His hands were resting flat on the counter. Large hands, scarred across the knuckles in ways that had long since finished healing. White lines against tanned skin. The hands of someone who had spent a long time solving problems that required force. "How long has he been here?" he asked. So he already knew. She wasn't surprised. Whatever had led him to her door, scent, instinct, a father's particular attunement to where his child was in the world. He had come with certainty rather than question. He was confirming, not searching. "About 2 hours," she said. "He came in just past midnight. He was bleeding." The stillness in him changed quality. It became heavier. "How badly?" "A gash along his left side. It was already closing when I cleaned it." "He's fine." She paused. "He's asleep." Something moved through his expression then, too fast and too private for her to name. He looked down at the coffee mug for a moment. When he looked back up, his face had resettled into its severe, neutral lines. "You helped him," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "He was a child who was hurt and alone," she replied. There wasn't a decision to make. He studied her with those gray-green eyes, and Josie held the look without flinching, though it cost her something. There was a weight to his attention that was different from ordinary scrutiny. Being looked at by him felt like being read, like he was taking in information she hadn't offered, cataloging things she hadn't said. She'd heard that about powerful alphas, that their perception ran deeper than most, that they processed layers simultaneously. She hadn't entirely believed it until now. "Josie," he said. Just her name, flat and even, as if checking whether it fit. "That's right. This is your diner. Has been for 3 years." He nodded once, slowly, as if filing that away. Then he picked up the coffee mug and drank. She watched his shoulders drop approximately half an inch, barely perceptible. But she'd spent 3 years reading people across a counter and she caught it. And something about that small, involuntary release of tension made him briefly, almost painfully human. "His name is Eli," Cassian said. "He told me." A pause. "He told you his name?" "Yes." He set the mug down. "He doesn't tell people his name." Josie didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing. She refilled his cup. He let her. "There were men in the forest tonight," he said, his voice dropping lower, not in secrecy, but in the particular quiet of someone choosing their words carefully. "They were not from my territory. They knew Eli's route. the path he takes when he rides out with his escort. That information didn't come from outside. His jaw tightened. Someone inside gave it. The implication settled over the counter between them like something with weight. Josie understood what he wasn't saying, that his son had been targeted deliberately, that someone within his own territory, within his trust, had arranged for it. "Is he safe now?" she asked. "The men in the forest. They're no longer a concern." She accepted that. "And inside? Is it handled?" "Not yet." His eyes met hers. "I came for Eli first." That answer did something to her that she hadn't expected. She turned away on the pretense of checking the warmer, giving herself 3 seconds to settle. There was something about the way he'd said it, "I came for Eli first," that bypassed her careful, practiced neutrality, and landed somewhere undefended. She had grown up knowing what it felt like when you were not someone's first priority. She had married a man who had taught her that lesson more thoroughly than her childhood had. She knew, in her bones, the difference between people who came for you first and people who came for you eventually, when it was convenient, when the cost was low enough. She turned back around. "I'll get him," she said. "Wait." He said it quietly, without authority, and that was precisely why she stopped. "Let him sleep a little longer. He's been running since sundown." Another pause, barely visible. "He's 8 years old." Josie looked at the man across her counter. The Alpha King of Asheville, who had probably not said the words "he's 8 years old" to anyone before, because it was not the kind of thing powerful men said out loud in explanation of their choices. Who was sitting on a cracked vinyl stool in a roadside diner at 2 a.m. because his child had been bleeding somewhere and he had moved through the forest to find him. "All right," she said. "More coffee?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The idea of one, maybe. "Yes," he said. They sat in a silence that surprised her with its quality. It wasn't comfortable exactly. She was too aware of him for that, too conscious of the size of the room relative to his presence, the way the light caught the sharp line of his jaw, the way his attention, even at rest, had a density to it. But it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people who were not performing at each other, and that was rarer than it should have been in her experience. After a while, she said, "He watched the door the whole time he was eating, every few minutes. He's been trained to. He looked like he was expecting something to follow him in." Cassian was quiet for a moment. "Something was," he said. "It didn't. Because of you." He didn't answer that directly. He turned the coffee mug in his hands once, a slow rotation, and said, "He chose to come here, to the light, to a place with someone in it." He glanced up briefly. That was his instinct, and it was correct. Josie thought about the boy walking through the dark toward her lit windows. She thought about how, when you were frightened and hurt and alone, you moved toward warmth without always knowing why. She thought about how that instinct could save you or destroy you depending entirely on who was holding the warmth. She was glad she'd left the lights on. She was glad she hadn't been quicker with the lock. Around 2:30, she heard movement from the back room. The small sounds of someone waking, boots on the floor, a pause. Then Eli appeared in the doorway between the back room and the diner, blanket still around his shoulders, and he went still when he saw his father at the counter. Something crossed the boy's face that was too complex for his age. Relief, guilt, a bracing for consequence, and beneath all of that, so plainly visible that it broke something in Josie's chest. Pure, uncomplicated love. Cassian had turned on the stool when he heard the footsteps. He looked at his son for a long moment. He did not open his arms immediately. He did not speak with the rushed warmth of a frightened parent trying to cover their fear with noise. He simply looked, the way you look at something you needed to see with your own eyes before you could believe it was intact. "Come here," he said finally. Quiet. Just that. Eli crossed the diner and walked into his father's arms, and Cassian held him, firmly, without performance, one large hand spanning the boy's back, and Eli pressed his face against his father's shoulder and went very still, the way someone goes still when they finally stopped running. Josie looked away. She busied herself with the counter. She gave them the privacy of her inattention, which was the best she could offer. After a moment, she heard Cassian's voice, low. "You did well." And the boy's reply, muffled. "I lost Garrett. Garrett made his own choice. That's not yours." A pause. "She helped me." Eli, almost inaudible. "The woman. She didn't ask anything." A beat of silence. "I know," Cassian said. When Josie turned back around, Eli was sitting on the stool beside his father, the blanket still around his shoulders, looking considerably less like a creature at bay. He met her eyes with those old, remarkable eyes. "Your pie was good," he said solemnly. "Thank you," she said. "It's my grandmother's recipe." He nodded as if this was important information, properly filed. Cassian was watching this exchange with an expression she couldn't parse, not quite unreadable, but in a language she didn't yet have the vocabulary for. "We'll leave before first light," he said, looking at her. "I don't want to bring attention to this place." He paused. "To you." There it was, the thing underneath the thing. He was telling her that she was now part of something, that a child of the Alpha King had sheltered in her diner, and that this was not a neutral fact. That the people who had arranged tonight's attack might eventually trace the route Eli had taken, might find the lit diner on the dark road, might wonder who had been inside it. Josie understood this. She was not naive about territory politics or about what it meant to exist at the edge of things. She also understood that he was warning her because he thought she deserved to know. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You'd have figured it out anyway." She wasn't sure if it was a compliment. She decided it was. "There's a room above the diner," she said, before she'd fully decided to say it. "It's not much. I use it for storage. There's a cot and a window. But it's off the main road and you can't see it from outside." She kept her voice level. "You should both rest properly before you move. Whatever you walked through tonight, you walked through it fast." The silence was careful. "We don't need," he began. "I know you don't need it," she said. "I'm offering it anyway." He looked at her for a long time. Something in his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. "All right," he said, quietly, like someone who wasn't accustomed to accepting things. Eli had already fallen asleep against his father's arm. She didn't sleep. Josie lay on her back in her small bedroom behind the kitchen, staring at the ceiling while the diner settled into its nighttime sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional tick of the pipes, the wind working at the window frames. And she thought about the choices a person makes without fully realizing they're making them. Opening a door, pouring a cup, offering a room. Each one small on its own. Each one, in retrospect, a step in a direction she hadn't consciously chosen. She thought about her ex-husband, which she tried not to do. Daniel had been the kind of man who made you feel chosen before he made you feel used. And he did it in that order with enough time between the two that you couldn't quite trace the seam. She had married him at 22, which she now understood was young enough to be forgiven but old enough to have known better. He had been handsome and certain, and he had wanted the diner. Not her, or not primarily her, though he'd been convincing about that part too. And by the time she understood the architecture of it, she had already signed papers and learned his moods, and shrunk herself in a dozen small ways to fit the shape of what he needed her to be. He had sold his half of the diner back to her 14 months ago, in exchange for her silence about certain financial arrangements he'd made using the diner's name. She had agreed. She had kept the diner. She had rebuilt slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild when you've learned that nothing is as stable as it looks, and so you'd better make what you have genuinely solid before you trust it with any weight. She was still rebuilding. She heard Eli shift in the room above her, the creak of the cot, one small thump that was probably a boot dropping, and then nothing. She heard nothing from Cassian at all, which meant either he was extraordinarily still or he wasn't sleeping, same as her. She thought that was probably it. She thought he was probably sitting in the dark above her with his back to the wall and his attention on the door, the same way his son had sat at her counter. She understood, finally, where Eli had learned it. Dawn came gray and cool, a thin light pressing at the edges of the curtains. Josie rose before it finished arriving, washed her face, pulled her hair back, and started the coffee. She had biscuits in the warmer, and eggs cracked into a bowl by the time she heard boots on the stairs. Cassian came through the kitchen door first. He had clearly not slept. There was something taut and careful about the way he moved, the alertness of a man who had spent the night on watch, but he had washed, and his expression was composed. He stopped when he saw the food laid out. "You didn't have to," he said. "I was making breakfast anyway," she said, which was not entirely a lie. He sat at the kitchen table, which was different from the counter, smaller, closer, the table she actually ate at, the one with the ring stain from her grandmother's tea kettle that she'd never been able to fully remove. Cassian looked at it like he noticed, and then looked away. And Josie put coffee in front of him, and didn't make anything of it. Eli came down 3 minutes later, more alive than he'd been at midnight, the gash on his side already reduced to a thin pink line that would probably be gone by evening. He ate with focused efficiency, and then looked at Josie across the table. "Do you live here alone?" he asked. "Eli," Cassian said, a single quiet note of correction. "It's fine," Josie said. "Yes, just me." Eli absorbed this. "That's a lot of work," he said. "The diner and the upstairs and everything." "It is," she agreed. "I don't mind." He seemed to be considering something. "Our cook at the main house complains about working in a kitchen with 3 other people. You do it with no one. Your cook has higher standards than me, probably." "She's very particular about her knives," Eli confirmed seriously. Josie laughed, genuinely, briefly. And when she looked up, Cassian was watching her with that unreadable expression again, the one that felt like a language she was just beginning to parse. She looked away first. They left as the sun fully cleared the tree line, Cassian's horses, 2 of them, dark and large, tied at the edge of the road where she hadn't seen them in the dark, brought around from wherever he'd left them. Eli was lifted into the saddle with the ease of long habit. Cassian checked the boy's bandage one final time, his hands careful and economical. Then he turned to Josie, who was standing on the diner steps with her arms crossed against the morning cold. "You'll send word if anyone comes asking questions," he said. It was framed as a statement, but she heard the request inside it. "I don't know how to send word to you," she pointed out. He reached into his coat and produced a small coin, dark metal, heavier than it looked, stamped with a mark she recognized as the Ashvale sigil. "Show this at the Northern Waypost. They'll know what to do." She took it. It was warm from his coat. "And if someone comes before I can get to the waypost? Then close your shutters, bar your door, and wait." His eyes were direct on hers. "I'll know." She wanted to ask how. She suspected the answer was more complicated than she was prepared for at this hour. She put the coin in her apron pocket and nodded. He held her gaze for 1 moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he mounted, and they rode toward the tree line, and Eli turned once in the saddle to look back at her with those remarkable eyes. And then the forest took them. Josie stood on her steps for a long moment after they'd gone. Then she went inside and started the day. 3 weeks passed. She told herself the weeks were normal. She opened the diner at 6 and closed it at 11, and in between she fed truck drivers and farmers, and the occasional hunter passing through, and old Mercer with his nightly slice of pie, and she did not think about gray-green eyes or a dark coin in her apron pocket, or the way the Alpha King of Asheville had said, "I'll know as if it were the simplest fact in the world." She thought about it constantly. On the 23rd day, a man came in for lunch who ordered nothing and watched the road. He sat in the corner booth for 2 hours, nursing a single cup of coffee, and Josie felt the quality of his attention and understood it was not the attention of someone eating lunch. He left without incident, but she tracked the direction he walked. Not toward the road, not toward the waypost town, toward the tree line, toward Ashevale. That evening she found a small folded note slipped under the back door. "The man who sat in your corner booth today works for a lord named Fenwick, who controls 3 territories south of Ashevale." He was confirming a location. "Leave the shutters open so we know you're well. Close them only if you're not. No signature." The handwriting was clean and controlled. She left the shutters open. On the 28th day, a woman came in. Well-dressed for the road, too well-dressed, with the practiced smile of someone who'd been trained to use it. She ordered tea and spent 20 minutes asking Josie gentle, friendly questions that were not gentle or friendly. Had she had any unusual visitors lately? Did she know the roads north well? Had she perhaps seen a child traveling alone recently? Josie smiled back with equal practice. She said she mostly saw farmers, and that the roads north were too rough for her taste, and that children traveling alone would be a worry, wouldn't it, though she personally hadn't seen any. She refilled the woman's tea twice. She was warm and uncomplicated, and completely empty of anything useful. The woman left. Josie went to the back room and stood very still for 60 seconds. Then she pulled the Ashevale coin from her apron, took her cloak from the hook, and walked to the waypost. Cassian came himself. She had not expected that. She'd expected a messenger, a guard, someone sent to collect information. Instead, the knock on her back door that evening was him, alone, different clothes, no coat, which told her he hadn't come from far, which meant he'd been closer than she'd realized for longer than she'd known. She let him in. He sat at the kitchen table again. Same chair, and she made tea because the coffee felt like too much at this hour, and he accepted it without comment. She told him about both visitors. He listened without interrupting, his hands flat on the table, his eyes on her face. "Fenwick," he said when she finished. "He's moving faster than I expected. Who is he to you?" A pause. "He was my father's closest advisor. When my father died, Fenwick expected to advise me." Another pause. Briefer. "I didn't want his advice." She understood the shape of that. The advisor who had expected to hold power through the son after the father, who had not been chosen, who had decided to take what he felt owed. She understood how betrayal built itself on proximity and expectation. "Is Eli in danger still?" she asked. "Eli is guarded at every hour now. He won't be accessible again." He met her eyes. "But you were seen helping him." Fenwick's woman confirmed the location. "They know a woman at this diner knows something." He said it plainly, without softening. "That makes this place a target." Josie looked at her kitchen, the ring stain on the table, the row of her grandmother's recipe cards tucked above the warmer, the window with the curtain she'd sewn herself from fabric that was the wrong shade of blue but close enough. 3 years of rebuilding, solid and small and hers. "How much time do I have?" she asked. "A week, maybe less." He held her gaze steadily. "I want to move you." She looked at him. "Move me. To Ashevale, to my territory, under my protection." He said it without embellishment, without the kind of framing that was designed to make it easier to accept. He said it the way he said most things, directly, as fact, leaving the response entirely to her. "You'll be safe. Your diner can be protected in your absence. When Fenwick is dealt with, you can come back." Josie was quiet for a long time. She thought about Daniel, who had framed everything as for her benefit, while quietly making her smaller. She looked at the man across her table who had just laid out an arrangement that would require her to leave the only stable thing she'd built and trust someone she'd met 3 weeks ago. "If I say no?" she asked. "Then I'll post guards on the road and we'll find another way," he said immediately. "I'm not going to force you." She believed him. That was the strangest part. She looked at his face, at the steady way he was waiting for her answer, and she believed him. She pulled the blue curtain aside and looked at the dark road and the darker tree line beyond it. She thought about the woman with the practiced smile. She thought about a child who watched doors. She thought about what it meant to be someone's first priority. "All right," she said, not easily, but clearly. "I'll go." Ashvale was nothing like she'd imagined. She had built a picture in her mind on the road there, a fortress, something cold and impenetrable, all stone and silence and the particular bleakness of a place designed to intimidate. She had grown up hearing the name like a warning, and so she had furnished it accordingly, the way you furnish things you fear. What she found instead was a working estate of enormous scale, set into a hillside at the edge of the forest, like it had grown there rather than been built. Dark timber and pale stone, towers that were broad rather than narrow, walls that were high but not hostile, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys into the morning air. There were people moving through the outer yards, stable hands and guards and women carrying baskets, the ordinary business of a large household proceeding at its ordinary pace. There were dogs sleeping in patches of early sun near the gate. There were kitchen gardens, just beginning to show their spring growth, tucked along the southern wall. It smelled of horses and wood smoke and fresh bread and cold stone. Josie sat in the carriage. Cassian had ridden beside it the whole way, close enough that she'd occasionally seen his shadow through the small window. And she looked at all of it and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. She named it eventually. It felt like somewhere that functioned, somewhere that had been tended. A woman met her at the main entrance, tall, somewhere past 50, with silver-streaked hair pinned severely and an expression of complete professional neutrality. She introduced herself as Marin, the house steward, and she took in Josie's traveling clothes and modest bag with the practiced non-reaction of someone who had received all manner of guests and had opinions about none of them. "I've prepared rooms in the East Wing," Marin said. "Private entrance from the garden, separate from the main corridors. You'll have quiet there." Josie noticed she hadn't said guest rooms. She'd said rooms, plural, as if Josie might need more than one, which she didn't. But the distinction suggested that thought had been given to her comfort specifically. "Thank you," Josie said. Marin nodded and led her inside. The rooms were warmer than she'd expected, and better furnished than she'd assumed. A sitting room with a fireplace already lit. A bedroom with a wide bed and linen that smelled of lavender and something faintly herbal. A window that looked over the kitchen garden and, beyond it, the first dark edge of the Ashvale wood. There was a writing desk, a wardrobe, a basin of warm water already waiting. On the small table beside the fireplace, a pot of tea, a covered plate, and a single branch of early blooming something in a clay jar, white flowers she didn't know the name of. She stood in the middle of the sitting room for a moment, holding her bag, feeling the disorienting sensation of being in a place that had prepared for her arrival before she'd fully decided to arrive. Then she set down the bag, poured the tea, and sat by the fire. She found her footing over the following days in the way she always found footing, through routine, through usefulness, through the patient accumulation of small knowledge. She learned the layout of the East Wing, then the main corridors, then the kitchen, which she visited early one morning, and where the cook, a compact, ferociously organized woman named Petra, who was indeed extremely particular about her knives, regarded her with deep suspicion for approximately 2 days before deciding she was tolerable. Josie helped in the kitchen without being asked, and without making it into anything, the way she'd always worked. And by the third day, Petra was explaining the particular requirements of feeding a household of 60 without being prompted, and Josie was listening with genuine interest, and they had arrived at something that was not quite friendship, but was solid and mutual. She saw Eli twice in the first week, once in the corridor outside the kitchen, where he stopped and regarded her with those serious eyes and said, "Very precisely. You came," as if it had been uncertain. She said yes. She had. He nodded once, processed this, and continued on his way. The second time he came to find her deliberately, appearing in the doorway of the sitting room one afternoon, while she was mending one of her dresses. The hem had caught on something in the carriage, and asking if she played chess. She did not play chess. He looked at the board under his arm and said that he could teach her if she wanted. She said yes. He was a ruthless teacher with no patience for carelessness, but genuine satisfaction when she made a move that surprised him. They played for an hour, and she lost badly both times, and Eli was not diplomatic about it. She found this enormously refreshing. She saw Cassian less. He was present in the way the estate itself was present. She was always aware of him, could track the shape of his days by the sounds and movements of the household, the guards' shifts, the timing of council meetings she could hear faintly through the stone walls of the east corridor. But he did not seek her out, did not appear at her door, did not manufacture reasons to be nearby. He respected her space with the same completeness he did everything else. And so the one time he did appear, 5 days in, knocking at the sitting room door in the early evening with the particular quiet knock of someone not certain their welcome, she was struck by how deliberate it must have been. A man who could walk through stone walls, figuratively speaking, choosing to knock and wait. "I wanted to make sure the rooms were adequate," he said. She looked at him. "They're more than adequate." He nodded, his hands loose at his sides. He was in simpler clothes than she'd seen him in, no riding coat, no formal layers. He looked less assembled, which paradoxically made him harder to look at directly. "I also wanted to tell you," he said, "that we've confirmed the scope of Fenwick's network. He has people in 4 of my border territories. The 2 who approached your diner were gathering confirmation, as we suspected." He paused. "It's larger than I initially assessed." Josie set down the book she'd been holding without reading. "How much larger?" "He's been building for years, since before my father died." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Possibly since during. She heard what he didn't say, that Fenwick might have had a hand in the death that had made Cassian Alpha King in the first place. She didn't press it. Some things needed room to be said on their own terms. "Eli was a message," she said instead. "Going after him." "Yes. Quiet. Fenwick knows I'll do anything to protect Eli. It was meant to show me the reach of his capability, that he could touch what matters most." He paused again, and she heard the control required to keep his voice that level. "It was also a test of my reaction, whether I'd move rashly." "You didn't." "No." He looked at her directly. "I came for Eli first." There it was again. That phrase. She felt it the same way she'd felt it the first time, landing somewhere undefended, bypassing the careful architecture of her detachment. "Fenwick doesn't know about me," she said, keeping her voice practical. "Not who I am. He knows someone helped Eli, not that I'm here now." "Correct. And I'd like to keep it that way as long as possible." He looked at the window. "But you should know the full picture. It's your safety we're managing." She looked at him for a moment. "You consult me." "Yes." "Most men in your position wouldn't." The corner of his mouth moved. "Most men in my position make poor decisions." She laughed before she could stop it. Not loud, barely more than a breath. And something in his expression changed very slightly when she did. Opened, maybe, by a fraction. She looked away before she did anything foolish with that information. It was Marin who told her about Eli's mother. Not as gossip. Marin didn't appear to have the architecture for gossip, but as practical context, delivered one morning when they were walking the kitchen garden together, and the subject came up sideways through a conversation about the household. The boy's mother left when he was 3, Marin said, the same tone she used to discuss linens and supply orders. She found the bond constraining, she said. The territory, the responsibility. She wanted a different life. A brief pause. She has one, somewhere south. She writes occasionally. Eli doesn't read the letters. Josie looked at the early spring growth along the wall. Does Cassian? He reads them. He doesn't respond. Marin's voice was absolutely neutral. He's never spoken against her to the boy. He's also never explained her absence in terms that weren't true. She glanced sideways at Josie. He's precise about truth. Josie thought about that for the rest of the day. She thought about a man raising a child alone in a territory he was also governing. Precise about truth, not inventing comfort. She thought about Eli's eyes that were too old for his age, and how that was not only because of what he'd survived in the forest. She thought about what it cost a person to be precise about truth when the lie would have been kinder. She thought about Daniel, who had been imprecise about everything and called it kindness. On the 9th day, she found the letter. It was not meant for her. It was on the floor of the corridor outside the council room, dropped, fallen from somewhere, overlooked in the movement of people in and out. She picked it up automatically, the way you pick up things that have fallen. She recognized the seal before she recognized that she shouldn't read it. By the time she understood what she was looking at, she'd already read the first 3 lines. She read the rest. It was from Fenwick, not to Cassian, to someone inside Asheville, someone who signed their response with a symbol rather than a name. The letter was brief and specific, confirmation that the woman from the diner had been located inside the estate. Confirmation that this was now the secondary leverage point. Confirmation that if the primary approach failed, she would be used. Used. The word sat in her chest like something cold. She was not incidental. She was not an accidental complication. She had been found and identified and filed as a tool, something to be used against Cassian if Eli could not be reached again. Someone inside these walls, someone who attended council, who moved in the corridors she moved in, who ate at the same table, had written back to Fenwick and told him where she was. She stood in the corridor with the letter in her hands and breathed carefully. Then she folded it, put it inside her dress, and went to find Cassian. She knocked at the council room door. The guard outside looked at her, assessed her expression, and knocked once for her without being asked. She heard movement, and then the door opened. Cassian looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him open the door fully without a word. He said something short to the room behind him, and stepped out into the corridor and pulled the door closed. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. She gave him the letter. She watched him read it. She watched his face do almost nothing. The discipline of a man who had learned to manage his reactions completely. But she saw the place behind his eyes, where something hardened into something else. Something cold and absolute. He folded the letter. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" he said. Yes. Then, because he was precise about truth and she was learning to be frightened, but thinking clearly, he nodded. "That's enough." A pause. More than enough. "There's someone inside," she said. "Someone who knows I'm here, who I am, why I matter." "Yes." His voice was completely level. "I'll find them." "I know you will." She met his eyes. "I want to help." He looked at her steadily for a long moment. In it, she felt everything she hadn't said being received. That she was done being managed, done being a secondary concern in a plan made for her. done being the thing that was protected without being consulted. That she was frightened, and she was angry, and she had a mind, and she intended to use it. "All right," he said, quietly, without hesitation. She breathed. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Ashvale, the Alpha King smiled, small, real, brief as winter sunlight, and said, "Come inside." The trader's name was Davin. He was 34 years old, had served on Cassian's council for 6 years, and had a wife in the eastern townships and a debt to Fenwick that predated his appointment by 3 years. Cassian had suspected him for 2 days before the letter confirmed it. Josie had helped narrow it. She described, without knowing their significance, 2 details from the letter's content that only someone present at a specific closed council meeting could have known. She'd read the letter carefully enough to retain it precisely, which was, Cassian said quietly, exactly the kind of thinking he needed. Devon was removed from his position on a Tuesday morning, quietly, without spectacle. Josie wasn't present for it. She didn't need to be. What mattered was what happened after. The interrogation, conducted by Cassian and 2 of his senior guards, that produced the full map of Fenwick's network inside Ashville. 4 people, not 1. 3 of them minor, a stable worker, a kitchen supplier, a border guard, who had passed information for money without full understanding of what they were feeding. Davin was the only one who had known entirely. Cassian told her everything. He sat at the kitchen table, their table, she had begun to think of it that way without quite meaning to, and laid it out plainly, the way he laid everything out plainly, and she listened and asked precise questions, and he answered them all. Fenwick's primary approach, he said, was always political. He's been building a coalition of southern lords who believe Ashvale's expansion threatens their autonomy. He's positioned himself as their protector. He paused. Going after Eli was personal. A demonstration of capability, as I said. But the coalition is the real threat. A public one, Josie said. Yes. He wants to challenge my authority through channels that look legitimate. Lord's Council, territorial dispute, formal grievance. His expression was even. Which means I can't answer it with force. I have to answer it politically. She looked at him. What does that require? A council meeting, neutral ground, lords from 6 territories at minimum. He turned the tea mug in his hands, and evidence of what Fenwick actually is versus what he presents himself to be. The letters, she said immediately. The letters. He nodded. His correspondence with Devon is enough to demonstrate conspiracy against the Alpha King and deliberate targeting of a child. That changes the political calculation for every lord he's recruited. They signed on to oppose territorial expansion. They didn't sign on to be associated with an attack on an 8-year-old. Josie thought about this. He'll deny the letters are genuine. Yes, which is why I need witnesses. He looked at her steadily. You found that letter. You can speak to where it was, what it contained, the circumstances. She understood what he was asking. Not just her presence, not just her information, her testimony. In front of a Lord's Council, in a formal political proceeding, as a woman from a roadside diner who had no title and no territory and no standing in any of these men's hierarchies. They won't take my account seriously, she said. Not bitterly, practically. They will if I present it correctly, he said. And if you present yourself the way you presented yourself to me the first night, without apology, without performance, with complete exactness. He paused. You are not nothing, Josie. You've never been nothing. The men in that room will understand that when you speak. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman she'd been before she came here, wiping counters alone at midnight, carrying a coin she didn't know how to use, telling herself the weeks were normal. She thought about Daniel, who had spent 3 years making her feel like a supporting character in her own life. She thought about what it felt like to be told, plainly and without ornamentation, that she was not nothing. "All right," she said. "Tell me what to say." "Tell the truth," he said, "exactly as it happened. That's all." The council convened 3 weeks later at a neutral estate 2 hours north of Asheville. Josie wore a dress that Marin had arranged. Deep green wool, well-made, the kind of garment that said, "I am not trying to impress you," which was itself a form of impression. Her hair was pinned back. She wore no jewelry. She carried nothing except her own account and the letter, which had been authenticated by 2 independent parties and was entered into the proceedings as formal evidence before anyone spoke. There were 11 lords in the room. Fenwick sat at the far end of the table, gray-haired and composed, with the particular smoothness of a man who had been managing rooms for decades. He looked at Josie once when she entered, and filed her away as inconsequential, which was the last miscalculation he made. She spoke for less than 10 minutes. She described the night Eli came to her diner. She described the boy's wound, his age, his fear carefully contained. She described the 2 visitors who came after, the watching man, the woman with the practiced smile. She described finding the letter, its location, its contents, the specific phrases she had memorized because that was how her mind worked. She did not raise her voice. She did not qualify or diminish. She was exact. When she finished, the room was quiet. One of the lords, older, white-bearded, from a territory far enough from Fenwick's influence to have nothing at stake in protecting him, said, "You're describing a deliberate conspiracy to use a child as political leverage, and subsequently to use this woman as a secondary instrument of coercion." "Yes," Josie said, "that is what I'm describing." Fenwick spoke then, smoothly, reasonably, the letter a fabrication, the woman clearly a tool of the Alpha King, the entire proceeding a manufactured grievance to suppress legitimate political opposition. He was very good at it. The words fell into the room with the practiced ease of long use. He was halfway through his 3rd sentence when Cassian spoke. He had been silent the entire proceeding. He sat at the head of the table in the manner of a man who understood that the most powerful thing in that room was his restraint, and he had maintained it completely. When he finally spoke, it was 2 sentences. "Lord Marin of the Eastfield Territories," he said, "will now read aloud the 2nd letter, the one found in Davin's personal correspondence, addressed not to Davin but to Lord Fenwick himself, dated 4 months before my father's death." The room went still. Fenwick's composure cracked. It was a small crack, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional shift in posture. But in a room full of men practiced at reading other men, it was loud. The 2nd letter was read. It was specific. It was damning. It described, in Fenwick's own hand, a plan to ensure the current Alpha King's father did not recover from the illness that had begun to slow him. It described the physician's cooperation. It described the expected outcome and what Fenwick intended to collect from it. It was not a plan that had been stopped. It was a plan that had been executed. The room after the reading was a different room than it had been before. Josie watched the faces of the 11 lords absorb what had just been laid in front of them. Not territorial maneuvering, not political opposition, but patricide and conspiracy against an Alpha King's bloodline spanning nearly a decade. She watched them recalibrate. She watched Fenwick become, in the space of a few minutes, someone none of them wanted to have been associated with. Fenwick was removed from the council before the session ended. The formal proceedings that followed were, Cassian told her afterward, largely procedural. The conclusion had been reached the moment the 2nd letter was read. The coalition Fenwick had built dissolved with the speed of things built on concealment, which is to say immediately, once the concealment was gone. Justice, Josie thought, looked less like a thunderclap than she'd imagined. It looked like a room going quiet, and men picking up their coats and a gray-haired conspirator being led out by 2 guards with the particular efficiency of something long overdue. It looked mostly like truth spoken plainly in a room full of people who had been waiting to hear it. That evening they rode back to Asheville in the carriage together, which was different from the journey there, when Josie had ridden alone. Eli was at the estate, safe with Petra and the particular supervision of a woman who managed 60 people's meals and had no difficulty managing one small boy. The road was quiet. The forest on either side was its ordinary nighttime self, full of ordinary sounds. Josie looked out the window for a while. Then she said, "The second letter. You had it before today." "Yes," Cassian said. "How long?" 5 days. She looked at him. "You waited." "I needed Fenwick in the room when it was read. I needed the coalition lords present. A letter presented privately as a document. A letter read aloud in front of 11 witnesses to a man who cannot deny his own handwriting is a conclusion." She nodded slowly. "You were patient." "I've had to be." A pause. "It's not my nature, particularly, but I've learned it." He looked at her directly. "You were very good today." She felt the words settle. Not the glow of flattery, something more substantial, more structural, the recognition of someone whose opinion she had come, without fully deciding to value. "I just told the truth," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's what made it good." They were quiet for a while. The carriage rocked gently. The horses moved at an easy pace, no urgency now, nothing chasing either of them. "What happens to Fenwick?" she asked. "Formal exile. Stripped of title and territory. He'll live. He's old, and the coalition is finished, and he's no longer worth the political cost of anything harsher." He paused. "His name goes into the record. What he did to my father, what he attempted with Eli. It doesn't disappear." She thought about that. About the difference between punishment and record. About how sometimes the most durable justice was the kind that simply ensured a thing could never be denied. "And your father," she said carefully. A long pause. "He deserved better than he got," Cassian said. "Quiet and simple and entirely without self-pity. I can't change that. I can make sure it's known." Josie looked at him in the dim carriage light. His profile, the line of his jaw, the hands resting on his knees that had fought wars and found his son in the dark and held a child's back while the child finally stopped running. She thought about all the things she'd been told about him. The closed fist, the name you didn't say completely, the feared Alpha King, and how none of it was wrong exactly, but none of it was the whole shape of him. "Cassian," she said. He looked at her. She had not planned what she said next. She had been careful for so long. Careful with herself, with her trust, with the soft places that Daniel had mapped and used. And she had not intended to be anything other than careful. "I don't know what this is," she said. "Between us. I'm not. I need you to know I'm not in a position to be reckless about it. I was reckless once, and it cost me 3 years and a version of myself I'm still putting back together." He was very still, listening. "But I also know that you knocked on a door when you could have walked through it," she said. "And you told me I could say no and meant it, and you gave me the whole picture every time, even when it was frightening." She looked at him steadily. "I know the difference between that and what I had before. I'm not confused about it. I'm just slow. About trust. I need you to know that going in." Cassian held her gaze for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "I found my mate," he said. "In a woman who fed my son without asking anything in return, and then told me the diner was closed when I was standing in the doorway." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm not in a hurry. I'm not going anywhere. You can be as slow as you need to be." She looked at him. She felt the thing in her chest that she'd been carefully not naming settle into its actual shape, which was not as frightening as she'd expected it to be. "Okay," she said, softly. He reached across the small carriage space and covered her hand with his, once, briefly, warm and certain and entirely without demand, and then let go. She looked back out the window. The forest moved past them, dark and quiet. Somewhere in its depths, ordinary things were living their ordinary lives. The road ahead was pale in the moonlight, clear and open. They married in the late summer, in Ashvale's great hall, with Marin presiding over the arrangements with the focused intensity she brought to everything, and Petra producing a wedding feast that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. Eli stood at his father's side with the bearing of someone taking the occasion very seriously, which was how he took everything. And when Josie came down the hall in a dress the color of winter wheat, he looked at her with those remarkable eyes and gave her a single approving nod that she found more moving than she'd expected. There was no elaborate ceremony. There were words spoken, simple and true. A bond acknowledged and chosen. Not just recognized, but decided upon, which was, Josie had come to understand, the only kind worth having. Old Mercer came, because she'd invited him, and he ate 3 slices of Petra's cake, and cried at the vows, and told anyone who would listen that he'd always known that girl was something special, which was not entirely accurate, but was entirely kind. The diner she kept. She hired a woman named Bess to manage it, competent, unflappable, with strong opinions about the coffee temperature that turned out to be correct. And it stayed open, and it stayed hers. A lit window on a dark road. A bell above a door. Fenwick spent his remaining years in a small estate far south of any territory that mattered, his name in the record, his coalition dissolved, his long calculation finally balanced. He died 4 years later, quietly, without significance. Devon was stripped of his position and removed from the territory. His wife, who had known nothing, was offered support she accepted. Some debts spread further than the people who made them. Eli grew into his eyes gradually, then all at once. He remained methodical and serious, and extraordinarily difficult to beat at chess. He called Josie by her name for 2 years, and then one morning called her something else without making anything of it, and she made nothing of it either, and that was how that was settled. Cassian remained exactly who he had been, precise about truth, patient against his nature, present in the way that mattered, which was not loudly but consistently. He learned over time to sleep without his back to a wall. He learned over time to put the mug down before it was empty, because there would be more. Josie rebuilt the last pieces of herself that still needed rebuilding, and then she stopped rebuilding and simply lived, which was different and better. She ran the territory with him and learned its shape and its people and its problems, and she was neither overwhelmed nor diminished by any of it. She had spent 3 years running a diner alone at the edge of a forest, and she was, it turned out, exceptionally good at managing things that needed managing. They had years, good ones, the kind that accumulate quietly into something that holds weight, not without difficulty. Territory politics and council disagreements, and the ordinary friction of 2 people building a life in the same space, but without the specific kind of difficulty that had defined her before, which was the difficulty of not being seen. She was seen, every day, completely. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough. On winter evenings, she would sometimes stand at the tall window of the east wing. Her rooms, still, though they had long since become their rooms, and look out at the kitchen garden and the dark edge of the forest beyond it, and she would think about a boy with blood on his shirt walking toward a lit window, because that was what you did when you were hurt and alone. You moved toward warmth. She was glad she had been the warmth. She was glad she had opened the door.